Hi, I'm Tom Woods, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I am your host, Doug Stewart, and today the topic is going to be a moral case for a free economy because we are talking with one of my favorite defenders of the free market, Father Robert Sirico, who is the president and co-founder of the Actin Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty and the pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and Academy in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Father Robert Sirico, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
You are one of the people that I really enjoy reading when you publish or, I have your book. And I always want to hear what you have to say about how the economy is worth defending, how a free economy is worth defending. So we're going to talk about that. And one of the reasons I like it is that a lot of free market defenders, whether libertarian or just people who want to defend capitalism, tend to make more of a practical case for it. And you and the Acton Institute make take a more moral approach. And I want to eventually talk about that. But it probably would be a good idea to sort of set the stage with a little personal story of like, how did you become somebody who defends a free market? Because you weren't always in that camp.
No, I wasn't. And it's a terribly long story, so I'll try and encapsulate. I was attracted to the left in the early 70s. And if you remember, that was a very turbulent time. It had just come out of 68 and into 70 was the end of the Vietnam War. It was the beginning of the feminist movement, the gay movement. I was living in California at the time, even though I'm a New Yorker by birth, I was living in California. And the farm workers were very big, boycott of Gallo wine and grapes. That was a very big empowerment. And so I was involved with various kinds of left-wing movements. Now, I need to be honest and say that I was not an orthodox Marxist. I was New Left, and really it grew out of a passion that I had for justice. I'd seen justice in the world. Growing up in the 50s, I saw the kind of racial prejudice, the bombing of churches, the beating of demonstrators, and also in my own neighborhood. My own neighbor was a survivor of the Holocaust. And so growing up with that and then seeing the world emerge, but without a good understanding of how the economy works, I became susceptible to the siren cries of the left, power to the people and all this kind of thing. And it was about that time that I tell a story in the book of after a demonstration. I was sitting in a room with a bunch of comrades, and we were talking about what was going to happen when the revolution comes. It was after a long day of protests, I recall. And I remember after everybody went around the room, it came to me and they said, what are we going to do when the revolution comes? And I said, well, we're going to shop at Gucci. And this shocked everyone in the room. And I was shocked that they were shocked. And I turned to my friend, Anne. She's, I always call her my lesbitarian feminist friend. She was a Trotskyite. I mean, a real member of the SWP. I mean, she was a serious Marxist. And she just looked at me and she said, Gucci? And I said, sure. She said, that's bourgeois. She said, but we want to create a world where people can buy goods and services at affordable prices, that they can have quality things. So I'm using Gucci as a metaphor of luxury accessible for people. And she just shook her head and she said, you're not a real socialist. And I've often remarked that there's nothing more uncomfortable in life than having someone tell you something about yourself that you don't yet know.
Mm.
And I didn't know it at the time, but once I met someone else about this period of time who gave me some books to read, I began to have, over about a 6-month period of time, the lights began to go up in the auditorium and I could see where things were placed. Whereas before I kind of just bumped into things out of emotion and instinct. And it was reading those books that clarified in my mind the importance of human freedom, especially as expressed in the economy, for people to have these luxury resources at their disposal. Because things we consider commonplace today were luxury items. It's something as simple as socks and shoes. They're ubiquitous today, but 2-3 centuries ago, those were luxury items.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just recently listening to an audiobook about liquid, and it was all kinds of different things. And one of the liquids was ink, and talking about the ballpoint pen and how,
Yes.
at some point in the past, it was a luxury to have the, it was like carrying around a cell phone in the late 80s, early 90s. You were important if you had an ink pen.
Right.
Because you had the occasion to need to write something at any time, and you were important.
Right.
And now we don't even, if someone steals your ink pen, you're just kind of like, yeah. I mean, it's like common property, right?
Well, and and the reverse is true too. Think of it, how now luxury is writing with a fountain pen. Or luxury isn't going out to eat anymore because everybody can go to a McDonald's. Luxury is having a dinner at home.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, your line about Gucci is a nice stand-in for the luxury that you wanted for everyone. I mean, did she not think that everybody should have quality goods? I mean, is that really what she didn't want?
No, if you had asked her that question, she would have said, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But then she said, probably, because there's a whole aesthetic to Marxism, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of, even if you have to spend $500 for a pair of torn jeans, you want them torn. You want them faded. There's an aesthetic to it that makes you look like one of the workers without thinking, how can we upgrade the whole lifestyle of workers? Which, of course, the market has done. I mean, there is no central planning office for the provision of shoes and socks.
Yeah.
And ballpoint pens. We don't need it because the market's provided all of that.
So your journey, you mentioned a little bit out of the Marxist way of thinking because somebody gave you some books and things. Between that and founding the Actin Institute, where did that lead you?
There was this other little question in the back of my head from my growing up in a Catholic home, and then at this point where I'm describing almost becoming an agnostic, an atheist, from reading and arguments and things like that with friends. There was the God question. And oddly enough, once I began to think in a systematic way about the economy, I found myself thinking in a systematic way about the nature of human beings, that is anthropology. And when I began to think about that, I began to think about more metaphysical questions, more spiritual questions. Why am I here? How did I get here? What's my destiny? What gives my life a sense of purpose and meaning? And it was then that I bumped back into God. My initial experience was intensely spiritual, but brief. I wouldn't call it mystical, but I would call it bordering on the mystical. That is, I knew something that was not the result of my conscious set of syllogisms to which I acquiesced. It was rather almost infused knowledge. I just knew that there was a God and reconverted to the faith that I was raised in. I went to confession to oddly enough, a Libertarian priest. Somebody had introduced me to a Jesuit. Jesuits have all kinds, all stripes. And this guy was a philosopher at Fordham University. Father James Sadowski was his name. And I was just supposed to meet him to show him around town. And I went to confession after 13 years. And I remember him sitting there at my dining room table before we went out to dinner. And I said, could you hear my confession? He looked at his watch. And I said, it's been 13 years since my last confession. And he was not a pastor, he was a professor. So I think it was unusual for him to just kind of experience this kind of thing. But in any event, he absolved me, and I began the reassimilation of my faith. And then, of course, I had to do these two things. How does one come back to a church? This was in the mid 1970s, and the church had gone through, in the previous decade, had gone through an incredible revolution of liturgy and aesthetics and politics even, because what had emerged was liberation theology. Of course, having been outside the church, I wasn't particularly aware of all this stuff. And then when I came back, I was confronted with it. And I was confronted with it both having adopted a freedom philosophy, but also having readopted my Catholic faith. So phase of this story is the integration between these two things.
Yeah. So as you integrated that, I mean, your journey is a little like mine, not quite, but in that you were fond of things like justice, and you wanted, like, you could see that there's needs in society out there, and there's a way to understand the way the world works that is not Marxist, that is not conditioned by Marxist, way of thinking. And the way in which you approach that as you re-enter your Christian faith, that must have been like a lot to handle, or maybe that's not the right way to put it, but that's a lot to sort of like have on both ends of things.
Well, it required a lot of reading and conversation. And in these years, because this didn't happen overnight, the conversion to a free market from the left took 6 months. But after that, I finished college. I went to college late. And after that, I went to seminary. And it was in seminary that I really began to do some serious reading on theology, philosophy, and economics. And the problem at that time was liberation theology, which, for your listeners who may not know, was the attempt essentially to baptize Karl Marx. It was an attempt to kind of take a Marxist social analysis and read it through a theological lens. And I was up against that, which turns out was a good foil, because it gave me some real issues. They raised basic issues about economy, about capitalism and things like that. And I was in an academic setting because I was in seminary, and I had some pretty good professors with whom I could have conversations and sometimes debates, which sharpened my own thinking. And that's how I began to make this integration. And I would call that the beginnings of the idea of the Actin Institute.
This I had this question planned for a little bit later when we talk about directly the morality of markets. But I wonder, I grew up Protestant, and remain a Protestant, and so my initiation or transition to a free market view, which I was always pretty much, nominally a free market person, that came with all of the assumptions that I had as a Protestant. And so one question that I have is, in what ways does having a Catholic faith as opposed to a non-Catholic Christian faith, how do you defend the market different from how other Christians might? I mean, is there something unique, or is there sort of I want to call it an angle, but I think you get where I'm asking the question.
Yes, no, I do. I think in the Protestant, at least in the traditional Reformed tradition, you have sola scriptura, right? So everything goes back to the Bible. Where do I find a verse that defends human liberty? Where do I find a verse that defends private property? Things like this. Catholicism predates the Bible. In the sense that Christianity predates the Bible, right? Christianity, the church existed before the canon of scriptures, which were only canonized in about the 4th century at the Council of Hippo. So when Catholics tend to ask questions, it's not to say that the Bible isn't an authority and a normative authority, but it's seen in context with the authority of the church, the magisterium, or the teaching office of the church, and the whole history of the church, what we call tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's these three pillars that kind of interact with each other. And that's what I had to ask, what is there in the Catholic tradition that would defend this? And I'd have to begin with human freedom, the mystery that God, who is sovereign, creates us free, and the responsibility, in fact, the necessity in making any moral decision, in performing any moral act, that volition is required. You can't perform a virtuous act without doing it freely. And I could walk you through the gestures of a moral act, and you would receive no grace from it if you didn't choose it.
Mm-hmm.
If I just forced you to do it. If I forced you to feed the poor, and the poor are fed, well, the poor may be benefited by that, but spiritually, if you've been forced to do it, there's no grace to you. If I give my body to be burned and have not love, I have, sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal, St. Paul says.
Yeah. Well, and I like to add that if, the rich can certainly their wealth can be redistributed to help the poor, but the vision of social justice that's, could be truly biblical is that the rich and the poor can dine together, and then they can take communion together. They can be together in a wholesome relationship, not just, oh, well, I have too much money and too much time, so I'll just pay a little bit in taxes or whatever, and so that they're fed. I mean, obviously, we don't want to discount the fact that people being fed is important, but
right. I think you're touching on another very important point that differentiates at least Marxism from Christianity, and that is this notion of whether our vision of society is essentially conflictual or essentially harmonious. In the Christian eschatology, it's harmony. And Bastiat wrote a whole book on this, economic harmonies, how we can become reciprocal, there can be a win-win situation in society. In Marxism, it's conflictual. There's class struggle, class warfare. And, I think it was Mother Teresa of Calcutta who said, we don't claim the right to condemn the rich. We don't believe in class struggle. We believe in class encounter, where the rich save the poor and the poor save the rich. In this, I think she has more economic insight than most economists.
Yeah, I really like that. So I want to stick with the Catholic question theme here for a second and just kind of how do you get your take on the current Pope Francis? And I don't need I don't need a scathing review or anything. I'm not looking for anything in particular, but just I know that there has been a shift as, just watching world events, watching statements being made over the last several years. It seems to be a shift away from more endorsement or more acceptance of freer markets. And so obviously you probably have to balance that in some fashion with your roles.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to balance it intellectually, and then I also have to balance it, how should we say, relationally. So relationally, let me just put it in this sense. My dad, is a New Yorker, Brooklyn, working class kind of guy. And he expressed his opinions on all kinds of things, as you can imagine. My dad was the original Archie Bunker. A number of times, he would say something and I would disagree with him. And I hope that I was always respectful in my disagreement with him. I loved him, but I didn't agree with him. And relationally, that's my feeling about this Pope. He is in my theological estimation, the successor of Christ. He possesses a certain authority, not complete. The Lord Acton quote that everybody is fond of, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, was not directed at politicians. It was directed at the Pope. So, I mean, this tension of and limitation of papal authority is something that goes back in our tradition a long way. So relationally, I have to kind of negotiate that. But intellectually, The Pope's authority, people immediately say, oh, you believe he's infallible. Well, I don't think if he tells me it's going to rain tomorrow and it doesn't look like it's going to rain, that I have to believe him. His authority, is what we call the charism, the gift of infallibility given to Peter and his successors, is limited to morals and doctrine, so that his speculations on science or art or economics is just that. He has to produce the argument. And when I look at what he says about the economy, just on the economy, or what the assertions he makes about history, I have to say he's just mistaken. And I think in large part, trying to be sympathetic and having held views similar to his at one point, I think it comes from his experience in Argentina in seeing the idea of a successful businessman was a crony capitalist. It was somebody who made their way in the world by utilizing political apparatuses and inhibiting their own competitors and various other things like this. Whereas John Paul II, who grew up under both communism and Nazism, emerges with a very different view of how the economy can function. And so that's where you get a lot of these very pro-market ideas in John Paul II's pontificate.
Yeah.
I think it'd be a corrective at some point to Francis on a number of different levels. I think you're dealing here with a man who isn't intellectually very sophisticated. He may be a good man in his heart. I don't know him personally. I've met him, but I don't really know him.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay.
No scathing reviews, just maturity.
No, that's all good. So I do want to talk a little bit about the Actin Institute with you from a really high level, high altitude way of looking at things. I mean, you have done, if the Libertarian Christian Institute can have the influence that the Actin Institute has, when we're your age, you're looking at what? You're 30 years now, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of influence over the decades, and we have very similar missions, very similar alignments with respect to, free markets. Our moral compass is set in the same direction,
yes,
as organizations. And so tell us a little bit about sort of what Acton's mission is and sort of the main pillars of how do you accomplish that? How are you accomplishing that?
Well, anyone who wants to really study that can go to our website. We have our principles articulated there. They're really laid out in I think, a rather cogent fashion. Basically, what we're trying to do is fill in the gap where people have good intentions about economy, but don't have good knowledge, don't have practical understanding about how an economy works. So one of the first things we want to do is fill in the gap of people's understanding. And we do this with a real awareness that economics as such emerges from the discipline of moral theology, historically speaking. I was speaking at the Mount Pelerin Society once, giving a paper, and Jim Buchanan was there, a Nobel laureate, Virginia School, public choice theory. Congenial man, I always had a good relationship with him. But at the end of my lecture in the Q&A, he got up and he said, Father Sirico, we're glad to welcome you to the discipline of economics, but why don't you just leave your religion out of it? And I said, Dr. Buchanan, thank you very much, but I think you've forgotten something historically. Economics itself emerges from the scholastics, from the school of Salamanca. So in effect, I am welcoming you economists to my discipline, theology, because you're contemplating the moral acts in the first place, the moral acts of individuals in the economic sphere. You've got, Rothbard has this whole survey of the scholastics and how they anticipate the Austrian school. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do. Make an integration, not trying to ideologize the gospel at all, but help religious leaders. Now, in terms of our mission, help religious leaders understand the moral potential of a market economy. That while it is important and necessary to have human freedom, human economic freedom in order to have prosperity, that's not enough. That's not sufficient. We need something more in our understanding. You can create a free society that is not a good society. And that's what we're trying to do. This is where we go beyond what Heritage or Cato or other groups do. We want to help people understand that these are two parts of the human reality, that we are both corporeal, physical, and transcendent. And that if we don't take into consideration these two dimensions of the human reality, whatever society we're going to build, whether it's a theocracy or a libertine society, that will be inadequate.
Well, I like hearing what you have to say there. Obviously, I align with everything you say in that, especially in that, it does mean that we can have a free society and not a good society.
Yeah.
I know that there might be libertarians who disagree with that like without some bent toward goodness, we wouldn't end up with a free society, if we ever do.
True.
So this might be a good time to discuss the term libertarian a little bit, because we align in so much, and you've mentioned to me that you're not terribly fond of the term libertarianism or libertarian, and I can understand possibly why, but I would love to hear a little bit more, because maybe libertarians need to rethink the reputation and what it means. I don't know. So I'll just give you a chance to answer that.
Well, Doug, I feel now like the person who's been invited to someone's home for dinner and tells the host that he doesn't like whatever lobster. I don't describe myself generally as a libertarian unless I'm with friends who understand what I mean by that, because I think in common parlance, when you say libertarian, there are several images that come to mind. In fact, because this is a libertarian audience, let me recount. People will remember when Ron Paul was running for president, and he was on the debate stage. And I guess one of the journalists asks, what would you do with a person who doesn't have private insurance? Would you let him die on the street? And there were a lot of libertarians in the audience because of Ron Paul. And people began yelling, yeah, let him die.
I remember that.
It's a kind of libertarian, instinct to respond like that without thinking more holistically, not just politically. I'm not just talking about the embarrassment of that to an audience, but is that really what you want? Is that the kind of society you want?
Yeah, right.
So I think that the term libertarian has been stolen, in effect, because to think, if you look at older uses of the word libertarian, it means something more general about the importance of liberty in social questions, or to use Acton's phrase, though of course the word, to my knowledge, wasn't extant in the Victorian era. He said that freedom or liberty is the political end of man, that the purpose of politics is to ensure for liberty, and that liberty is the necessary prerequisite for virtue, that people have to, at least interiorly, choose things freely. The word libertarian, I think, means, I don't want to spend my time defining a word or being seen as sectarian, the other problem with the word libertarian is it's seen as a kind of crazed sect of people. And libertarians have to own this. We all know the libertarian flasher, right? They go to a party, and their idea of spicing up the discussion is to proclaim, drug legalization first thing, in some some white-haired lady's home. Or I remember I was once at a gathering of academics, and there were some people who were kind of marginally conservative, marginally libertarian, but they ran into this libertarian buzzsaw who immediately began to make the argument about the liberty of people to make nuclear weapons in their basements, the basement of their home. That kind of thing. I mean, is this what we're talking about when we talk about libertarian? Well,
Right.
some people will say, yeah, that's what we're talking about. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the general thrust that society advances when it sees liberty as a central feature of that society. By the way, the other word I don't like very much is the word capitalism. Aside from being a Marxist word, it's too narrow a word. It concentrates on capital rather than a free economy. And so when we speak about a free economy or a liberal society, a classically liberal is another one of those words, it floats.
I refuse to let the progressive left own that word.
No, me too. I describe myself as a liberal, sometimes a classic liberal.
Yeah.
All the time. And I find myself attitudinally being that way. I'm not generally hostile, viscerally hostile, despite being a New Yorker, to people who disagree with me. I like to have different points of view, and it's always much more interesting that way. So, I find the word libertarian problematic.
It seems like it has a cultural stigma that is repulsive to people who already aren't predisposed to even align with us on our moral and practical case for free economy. But even for everybody else, it's like it. And honestly, now that you're the way that you're saying all that, I'm just like, well, man, everything has become about cultural identity in the last 10 years.
Yeah, no,
and it's like, oh, I'm going to identify as, this collective. And, I, admittedly have a little bit of like, I'm a libertarian. That's part of who I am now. It's like a self-identity thing. And it becomes a little bit of a cultural flavor to it. And there's a stigma or baggage or however you want to put it.
Yeah, I think the stigma, probably relates to Ayn Rand, who oddly enough denounced the word, didn't like libertarians, saw them as intellectual bloodsuckers or parasites or whatever she said.
Yeah.
And I think when people see the kind of anger and meanness in Rand, in her attitude, harshness, that it's repulsive. This is a woman, you could watch some of her old interviews, and much of what she says you'd agree with, but frankly, it's kind of like Donald Trump. I want to duck every time he says something, even if I'm agreeing with what he says.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. So I said at the beginning of this episode, we were going to talk about a moral case for a free economy, and we've sort of maneuvered around it a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And one of the reasons that I think that I agree with you about the word capitalism, even though I still continue to use it, I think it's worth explaining the difference, is the word consumerism sort of gets attached to it in most people's popular mindset, is that when people think of capitalism, they think of consumerism. They don't think of the things that I know the Actin Institute is very much about, which is things like stewardship and entrepreneurship. Like those things are not exactly the virtues, if I can use that word, that people think of when they think of capitalism. They think of just endless consumption. And, in your book, Defending the Free Market, you talk a little bit about consumerism and why that's not capitalism.
Right. Of course, people have to consume, right? that's cool,
right?
among other things. But consumerism becomes the be all and end all of existence, or of in this case, the economic system. And it isn't. I think it's much more creativity. I think it's much more problem solving. The result of that is when it has the institution of private property and the rule of law surrounding it. The result of that becomes prosperity and the ability to consume, to have things at your disposal that you might not otherwise have had. And I think to go to the moral core of a free economy is to go back to the original thing that we started talking about, and that's anthropology, who human beings are. And it seems to me this is the kind of moral core of the thing. Human beings are, as I said, a composite of heaven and earth. God forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes into him the breath of life. So there's the physical and the spiritual. That's part of it. That's one dimension of who we are. The other dimension of who we are is that we are individual. There's another word, by the way, individualism. We are individual. We are biologically distinct from our mothers, even in the womb. We're part of her. You know, we exist within her, but we're not physiologically a part of her.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the whole of our lives after that is the playing out of this individual and social reality. So these two categories of individual and social and physical and spiritual form the basis of an anthropology that I think are best protected and accounted for by a regime that protects private property, that allows people to live in a maximally free way, according to their own consciences, and that our destiny is held within our own hands, and rather than taken out of our hands and defined for us by politics. It's the whole notion, too, that society, you know, I mean, we're seeing this right now in this historical period in the United States. Everything is political. Even disease has become political.
Mm.
This is because of the overarching prerogatives that have been taken by the state, that they can tell us what to eat, what kind of food to eat, where we can eat, under what circumstances we can entertain, what we wear, and down the line, everything, including our medicine and the research into our drugs, controlled by the state. So when you have a pandemic, of course it's going to be politicized because it's been politicized.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a surprise to people how 2020 is shaped up to be overly politicized or just politicized because it's been leading this way. And people like you and I have sort of seen it coming, and now there's occasion to see people grasping for power.
Yeah,
you know, I lament the most that the people who are in my sort of Facebook circle of friends that are more on the left. The thing that I lament the most is that they seem to have this sort of, I want people to, like, their attitude seems to be, now we finally have a chance based in science, how their understanding of it, that we can tell other people what to do.
Yeah.
Like there's an opportunity for subjugation, even if it's temporary. No one would admit that governors should have this, perpetual power, except maybe the governors themselves. But it just seems, that's the thing I lament the most, is that the average person is just, they're so happy that their Democratic governor is telling, other conservatives that they don't like what to do and what all the things you just mentioned. And it's really sad because it doesn't bring us together.
No, it doesn't. And what it does more specifically is, like the overarching power of government in general, is it's predicated on a pretense to knowledge. If we're going to learn anything about the science of this pandemic or this particular disease, we're going to do it because people are free to engage the facts. And engaging the facts, especially when they're not centralized, when the study of that is not centralized, means competition. And when the government
or kept private,
or kept private, isolated, monopolized. When you have a free society of competing ideas and debates that are going on, and even experiments where people, will live differently in different circumstances and different locales, we learn from that. I mean, it doesn't take very long. This is a brutal example, but it doesn't take very long for addicts on the street to know that there's bad heroin on the street. They don't get an FDA seal of approval on their next shot, right? Mm-hmm. They learn it because they're free. Somebody's been free to make the mistakes. Now that is brutal, as I say, But that's reality. And ignoring that reality results in even more deaths by centralizing and pretending to know and then having to defend what you have defended. And that's the situation you get into.
Well, I have a million other questions that we could keep talking about and topics and stuff. And
Sure.
when all of the, when the pandemic is over, I hope to visit Acton at some point, and maybe we'll be able to sit down and discuss some of these, or maybe I'll have you back on the podcast.
I would enjoy that because, you can imagine I do a lot of these kinds of interviews and stuff, but usually it's having to begin at a very different place than where we began. And so it's refreshing to kind of have a conversation, not just with someone who agrees with a good deal of what I've already made some of these integrations, but, just somebody who is reasonable, not afraid of argument.
Yeah, well, good. I'm really glad to have you on. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Doug.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.